The Joe Rogan Experience.
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s, around the time when there were a lot of, serial killers beginning to pop up. And there always had been this question, why are there so many serial killers in the Pacific Northwest? And so that was the question I was really thinking about. And the premise, as it emerged from the research that I did and from some of the facts that I learned about what was happening in the Northwest in the run up to the 1970s, is that there may be a connection between the lead pollution that was prevalent in the area because of smelters and leaded gas and serial killers. Because lead, of course, as I think most people now know, has a connection to heightened aggression and violence in the people who've been exposed to it. So that was, what emerged to me gradually over the years. I mean, I didn't know a lot about this when I started. I knew about the serial killers, but I didn't really know about the whole lead story. And that came about, I learned about it in part because of some murders. I mean, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a lovely place. Unfortunately, New Mexico has a high rate of homicides. In part, it's because it's a poor state and doesn't have a big tax base and has, some issues with drug and alcohol addiction. And a few years ago, maybe 2008 or something like that, a couple people were murdered down the street from me. And I live in a very peaceful neighborhood, and that was something that really made me start thinking about the issue of maybe, it might be a good idea to think of moving back to the Pacific Northwest, which I wanted to do anyway because I have family up there. And a few years later, because of that, I was up in the Northwest and looking at real estate ads. And at this point, I didn't really know anything about the smelter or the lead issues. But I was looking at property on Vashon Island, which, if you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, is in Puget Sound. It's right across from West Seattle. Beautiful little, it was quite rural when I was growing up there. Beautiful place. And I came across a real estate ad that said, and this is just for undeveloped property, and it said, arsenic remediation may be necessary. And I thought, wow, what could possibly have caused so much arsenic pollution on Vashon Island that you would have to get it remediated? I mean, that just seemed crazy to me. And I was so curious about that, and I looked it up online and, within minutes discovered that there had been an infamous lead and copper smelter in the city of Tacoma, which is just south of Vashon Island. And so Vashon received a lot of the pollution from that smelter. And so that began a whole process of kind of learning about what happened here, what happened in this region. And I also knew, because I'm sort of really interested in serial killers, as I mentioned, and had been for a long time, reading about them and reading about Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway. And I knew that both Bundy and Gary Ridgway, who was the Green River killer, had grown up in Tacoma at the same time that this smelter the smelter had been operated operating there since the 1880s, 1890s, so for a very long time. And I could see that a lot of news media had been devoted to looking at what had happened in this region. You know, there was a whole map, a GIS map, geographic, information systems that allowed you to look up individual houses, residential homes in Tacoma, and see how much arsenic and lead pollution was in the yards. So I discovered that you could actually look up the house where Ted Bundy grew up and see how much lead was in his front yard and his backyard. And the more I read about lead pollution and lead, the association with aggression and violence, the more I wondered, is there a story to be told here about this issue? This is at a time when the term serial killer wasn't even really in use yet. People didn't really understand the phenomenon. It was still kind of an unusual thing, and this was happening. Women were disappearing from dorm rooms or their rooms at University of Washington. They were disappearing off the street, and then they weren't seen again for weeks, for months. In the July of 1974, I was 13, and on a really hot, Sunday afternoon in 1974, 2 women disappeared from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish, which was about, 10 minutes from my house. And so having had that experience of being around at that time, it was incredibly, it was both really disturbing, but also I just really wanted to understand what was happening.
So did you plan on writing a book about serial killers, or was this understanding of the lead and the arsenic what led you down to write this book?
Yeah, I never really wanted to write a book that was just about serial killers. I mean, I think that's been done,
Right.
And lots of people have done that and done a good job, I mean, Anne Rule, the woman who wrote the first book about Ted Bundy, who knew Ted Bundy.
Oh, she knew him.
Yes, she worked with him at a rape crisis clinic
Oh, my
in
God.
Seattle. Yeah.
He worked at a rape crisis clinic. Wow.
Yeah. He was very interested in doing research on rape.
Wow.
Because, of course, he was something of an expert. So, yeah, that was why that book was such a phenomenon, because she knew him before anybody had identified, anything in him. She liked him. She was friends with him.
Wow.
She gave him, a ride to the Christmas party.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Was this while he was killing or before he started?
Well,
Is it
the
known?
thing that we don't really know about Ted Bundy is when he started killing. He would never answer that question. And one of the cases that I talk about that really is part of what made me want to write this book is a case of an 8-year-old girl who was abducted in Tacoma in 1961, in August of 1961, Anne Marie Burr. And he was 14 at that time. And he is now one of the principal suspects, I think, behind her abduction.
Oh, wow.
So that may have been his first
14.
murder.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was there like a history of him torturing animals or anything along those lines?
No, but one of the things that I think the FBI was discovering when they started doing all this, investigation of the pasts, the childhood of serial killers, was that this starts really young, that the fantasies and the obsessions with, some of them famously do torture or kill the
Right.
family pets and
Yeah.
so forth, with Ted, that wasn't the case. I think with him, one of the things you see is that he never knew who his father was. He was born illegitimate at a foundling home in Vermont, and his mother left him there for a couple of months before she went back and kind of retrieved him. And that's a common factor with a lot of these guys. They don't know their dad. They don't know who he is, maybe, or they have a very bad relationship with the parents. There's maybe abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. We don't know that about Ted Bundy in terms of the abuse factor, but he remains, I think, really puzzling to people for that reason, because you don't see some of the usual signs with him.
And because he refused to answer questions?
Well, he talked a lot about, various people were able to interview him. The detective in King County in Seattle, who was in charge of the investigation, he was actually quite young when he took this on. I think it was his first major case as a detective. He eventually was able to interview Ted Bundy in prison when he was on death row. Bundy, for a variety of reasons, wouldn't talk about anything that he did except hypothetically in the third person, because he was still trying to work the legal system, and so he didn't want to admit to what he'd done.
How did he talk about it hypothetically in the third person?
I mean, it was sort of like O.J. Simpson or something. He would say, well, if somebody was going to do this, here's what he probably would have done. And so there was a lot of that up until the very last days of Bundy's sojourn on death row. And then he finally began confessing in the last 2 or 3 days, in an attempt, I think, to get the governor interested in perhaps extending his life because he could give information about where bodies had been left and so forth. But that didn't convince the governor of Florida.
So when you saw this real estate and you found out that it needed to have arsenic removed from it, this began this sort of journey that you went on to try to connect this area with serial killers and toxins. And what did you find? Like, is there a disproportionate number of serial killers that come from that particular area?
Yeah, there really are, as I discovered, a really kind of extraordinary number. And it's hard to talk about these numbers simply because we don't know what a normal number of serial killers in a given population.
Get caught? So are there like undiscovered serial killers that are in that area, or maybe deaths that are attributed to unknown people?
There are several cases that have never been resolved. There's something called the dismemberment murders that,
dismemberment murders?
Yeah, up in the Northwest, where, various feet and things were found washing up on shore, and nobody could figure out who they belonged to.
Oh, I remember that. That was fairly recently, right? Am I thinking of the same thing?
It may be another thing that you're thinking of, but I think this dates
there's another
back.
thing. It was like shoes that had a human foot in it.
And they could have just been, bodies of people who drowned, because that's, I think, what happens in some cases. So I think that's a sort of question mark. There are a couple of others. There's one in Idaho that they've never solved. So there are those cases, but even aside from those, I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at the year 1974 because it seemed really active in terms of what was happening with serial killers around the country and in the Northwest.